Thank you. Thank you, Pushkar, and thank you for the organisers for inviting me. It's a very great pleasure and privilege to be here giving what I understand is a first Maureen Brunt lecture. And she's a wonderful person to be following, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I'm going to be talking today about an overview of things I've found interesting over the last few years, with a few other ideas thrown in. And I'm going to be beginning with a little bit about the origins of the patriarchy. Now, needless to say, I'm not an expert in the origins of the patriarchy, being an economist, but I have read about this, and I'm particularly interested in the notion that the bargaining power between men and women has been shaped by our evolutionary history. So millions of years ago, our ancestors began to colonize what is often termed the very risky evolutionary niche of a long childhood. And the point of the long childhood is to be able to have bigger brains. And I'll come on to that in a minute. So the long childhood needed more cooperation between the sexes to ensure the survival of the offspring. So sex became not merely for reproduction, but also a cooperative venture. So, large brains are for perception, cooperation, reciprocity, and the cognitive challenge of keeping track of mutual obligations. These are functions that might be thought of as for natural selection, for survival. And large brains, of course, relate to long childhoods. As a baby's skull only just fits through the mother's pelvis, birth had to precede brain and body development. And that it therefore became imperative to have complex social arrangements to feed and protect the dependent child for so long, and the mother too. And both mother and child needed meat and calories to support the growing brain. And foraging for this diet required ambitious and cooperative hunting and gathering arrangements. Now, the similarity between male and female hominid brains suggests that they faced equally sophisticated cognitive challenges throughout almost all our evolutionary history. And on this view of the subordinate and dependent condition of women characterizing relatively recent centuries, cannot have obtained for most of the time since we diverged from the chimpanzees and the bonobos. As an aside, I find this really interesting, that the female older bonobos are matriarchs and influential in their society, in contrast to the chimpanzees, which is a patriarchal society. And we diverged between 6 and 9 million years ago. So I now want to think briefly about the end of hunting and gathering and what happened to the relative bargaining power of men and women with the introduction of agricultural cultivation. There's a development economist, Esther Bothrop, who distinguished between two forms of soil cultivation to prepare the ground for planting. there was labour-intensive shifting cultivation, which used handheld devices, such as a hoe and the digging stick, which both sexes were able to do. But then there was the development of the more capital-intensive plough cultivation, and that required upper body strength to control the plough. So that change in technology had implications for who did what. And the plough cultivation gave men a comparative advantage relative to women and led to a division of labour in which men worked in the fields while women specialised in work around the home. This was a really important development. And that gender-based division of labour then gave rise to a culture which codified women's place as being in the home. It was also associated with the accumulation of wealth. And with the accumulation of wealth, with men having a comparative advantage in the plough technology, it then became feasible to view women as, I was going to say works of art, but creatures who could be, just think of some of those earlier societies, or indeed in the last century and before, where women, if you're rich, you have your female partner, and she is like she's like an asset. I suppose that's a good way of defining it. And so that further accentuated the differences between men and women and the cultures. So a testable prediction of Bosrup's view is that cultures based on plough cultivation are characterised by less equal beliefs about gender roles. And there have been some work, there's some studies on this, and the one I'm particularly fond of is a paper in the QJE by Alison, Juliana and Nunn, which is looking on the origin of gender roles, women and the plough. And this shows that people whose ancestors engaged in plough agriculture are characterised by greater gender inequality. I might say that if you look at that paper and you look at the number of referees who are engaged in that, it's a fairly common story, isn't it, that if a paper is at all controversial or novel, it's not going to get through with just one or two referees. It's going to need a lot of referees, and there were indeed a lot of referees for this paper. So these changes became codified over time in customs and institutions. This is what we were hearing yesterday in the lecture, yesterday afternoon. And there's another very recent book that I rather like by a science writer called Angela Saini, The Patriarchs, How Men Came to Rule. And it's about patriarchy establishing itself. And she focuses in particular on the spread of the Indo-European language and the social structures that moved with these languages as they moved further west. And what she emphasizes is the rise of the state. This is really important, that as the societies are growing, the state arises in order to manage the societies, but also to perpetuate some of these gender roles. So over time, these customs altered slowly in response to technological developments, making household production more productive and market production less reliant on brawn. So when I say altered slowly, this is something that it's still going in the last century and still going in this century. And so we are gradually shifting away from a world where upper body strength was all crucial and conferred a lot of power on those who had it, which was largely men. And as we had these technological revolutions in machinery, in technology, in the way of managing the household economy, life became less reliant on brawn. And accompanying those technological changes were socio-political changes as well. So now we're shifting to a post-industrial world in which the bargaining power of women is again changing. So if you look around you at all the activities that would have once required a lot of brawn, just take a very simple one like house construction. There's a lot of house construction going on in Canberra. All the nice old houses are being knocked down, and these very large new houses are being constructed with underground car parks and cinemas and a lot of technology to dig out that ground because it's very, very hard. So this is an example of activities where you'd think a lot of brawn would be required, but these builders and construction workers are using big capital equipment, and it's perfectly feasible for people without upper body strength to operate these, should they so desire. So this is our shift to a post-industrial world. Robots as well, and the power of women is again changing. So many, but not all societies are moving towards greater equality and cooperation between the sexes. Unfortunately, there's a reaction to this as well, as you only have to look at the newspapers, recent newspapers, to see this. So against this background, I want to talk a little bit about male and female competitive behavior. And my co-authors and I have done some studies. I hope to talk briefly about 4 of them, but I may only get time for 2. And we've been looking at studies from the laboratory and the field. So the thing that has always interested me, are women simply less competitive? Do women shy away from competition? And men perform better in competitive environments? And if so, why? Are there inherent biological factors or environmental and technological factors? So I'm going to talk about 3 studies, 3 sets of studies. The first is based on an experiment using different birth cohorts in Beijing and Taipei. And we're using in this a simple experiment, and I'll explain that to you in a minute, The second experiment is looking how performance varies across different environments using data from a competitive sport in Japan. And in this competitive sport, it's very lovely for us because it randomly assigns participants into mixed sex and single sex races. And then lastly, if we've got time, we'll look at how psychological pressure affects the behavior of high ability girls and boys as gaming technology alters. So China was a really interesting case. Gender equality under Mao. And in 1950, China introduced the new marriage law to establish equality for men and women in marriage and family, education, land rights, and workforce participation. Before this, Confucian values dominated, and women were very subordinate, had very few rights. And Mao's denounced this and then introduced a mass media propaganda campaign promoting gender equality. For example, women hold up half the sky, and a person capable of working but who doesn't is a social parasite. And here you are. These are rather glorious propaganda posters. Here we've got working is glorious, men and women are equal. And here we've got women can hold up half the sky, which I think is a really lovely expression, the notion of women holding up half the sky. Now my co-author on this project, she lived through the Cultural Revolution, and it was really very important to her to do this paper. So it was a lovely opportunity for us to use these changes in gender-relevant social norms in mainland China as natural experiments. So from 1949 to 1977, we've got a switch from Confucian to communist culture. In 1978, we've got a switch from communist to market-dominated individualistic culture. And so we want to examine gender gaps in choosing to compete across cohorts growing up in different regimes. And we use Taiwan to gauge potential counterforce. So just a word about choosing to compete. This is rather a nice little thing to examine because it relates to economically relevant preferences. So what about Taiwan? Well, like mainland China, Taiwan was mostly Han Chinese, 95%. Early migration from the mainland occurred in the 13th to the 16th centuries. And then in 1948 to 9, the Kuomintang lost power to the Communist Party of China and retreated to Taiwan. And Taiwan shares the same language and Confucian cultures as mainland China did, but it had no revolutionary ideological change. Traditional values remained dominant. Nonetheless, economic growth and rising average education increased social awareness of gender equality. So the experiment was, I was going to say it's a simple design, but in fact it was quite complicated. It's only simple ex post. And we're looking at the 1958 birth cohort, subjects from the 1958 birth cohort, who spent all their school years in the Cultural Revolution period. Of course, they didn't go to school, but they spent those years in the Cultural Revolution period. Then we have the 1966 birth cohort, 3 primary school years in the Cultural Revolution, and the rest in the Reform era. And then the 1977 birth cohort is entirely in the Reform era. And we wanted individuals who'd spent their crucial development years in these periods. In Taipei, we have the same 3 birth cohorts. So we did the experiments in Beijing at Peking University and in Taipei at the National University of Taiwan. And rather conveniently, we have as co-authors, we've got 2 former colleagues from the ANU, one of whom is at Taipei and the other one in Beijing. And then one of my PhD students went along as well to assist in training the army of research assistants that we needed to do this. Now, in order to ensure representativeness, we used household survey data from Peking, from Beijing, and from Taipei to get cohort-specific gender, education, employment distribution. And we recruited subjects based on a quota for each cell. And the goal was 60 subjects for each cohort in each city. Those of you who are familiar with these exercises trying to establish economically relevant preferences will probably be familiar with the competition experiment. What we did in our experiment was to give the subjects, we asked them to add up 5 sets of 2-digit numbers in 5 minutes. And the payment methods in round 1, they were paid by a piece rate. In round 2, a tournament. And in round 3, a choice between the piece rate and the tournament. And the other controls were ability, risk-taking, because we did other experiments as well, so we could use the results from some of these as controls, overconfidence, gender mix, and session size. So the main results were very interesting. That women growing up in the Mao regime were more competitive than their male counterparts. Their experiences had a really profound effect on their behavior. They were also more competitive than later female birth cohorts, more competitive than Taipei female counterparts. In Taipei, interestingly, there were no significant differences across gender or cohort. And we also have robustness checks and explore mechanisms. So you can make of these results what you will. You could say, okay, this reflects the power of propaganda. You could say this reflects the built-up urges of women to be able to have some sort of free life. And I've just got on this slide that the findings confirm that exposure to different institutions and social norms during the crucial development stage, change individuals' behavior. And I was thinking about this when in Siwa's talk yesterday with the way of, strong gender equality message for a relatively short period can change women's willingness to compete. And of course it takes a very strong government, and we certainly don't all want to have Chairman Mao descending on us, but it takes a very strong government to introduce this form of behavioural changing techniques. So that's the Beijing, the Peking, the Beijing and Taipei experiment. The next one is speedboat racing in Japan, which I had never heard of speedboat racing in Japan. How many of you have heard of speedboat racing in Japan? Just a few. So I was approached by E.G. Yamamura with this project because he had a wonderful collection of data, and he knew what I was interested in, and he asked if I'd like to work with him, and I jumped at the opportunity. So in speedboat racing in Japan, women and men compete under exactly the same conditions. All individuals are randomly assigned by the Japanese Speedboat Racing Association to mixed sex or single sex groups for each race. Oh, I pressed the wrong button. I've got it back again. There. And so we have a sample of over 140,000 observations of individual level racing records. And so we're able to examine how male-dominated circumstances affect women's racing performance. And we can control for a number of other performance affecting characteristics, including the number of higher grade and lower grade races in a race and experience. Now I should tell you that this is a sport in which there's betting. There's a lot of betting. And in Japan there are only 5 sports that you're allowed to bet on. That's motorbikes, bicycles, speedboat races, football, and one other that I've forgotten. And the tournaments are controlled by the Japanese Speedboat Racing Association. And you may wonder why. Why did they introduce this notion of mixed sex, randomly assigned people to mixed sex and single sex races? And they did it because they wanted to, so I understand, to sex up the races a bit, get more interest in the races. All races receive the same intensive training, and it's very demanding. It's a whole year. It's very competitive to get into it. And once you're in it, you have to stay the full year, you do an exam, and very few of you get out to be able to race. The only difference in conditions between men and women is weight. Men have to weigh over 50 kilograms and women over 47.5. So women represent approximately 13% of all races. Yes, most of us would be excluded from those races. I certainly would, and I always thought I was quite light. So women represent 13% of all the races. Oh yes, the rules of the races are very strictly monitored. I mean, this is a sport with, as I said, a lot of money hangs on this. And breaches result in disqualification and severe penalties, which are very costly. So racers have an incentive to follow the rules, but in order to win, they may have to engage in risky lane changing. And that's a real art, to be able to do that without being penalised. So here's a picture of the betting hall before the hordes are allowed in. Now, there's no mandatory retirement in speedboat racing. So the racers range in age between 18 and 70. In order to get into the racing school, the minimum age is 16. There are 24 speedboat racing stadiums throughout Japan, and boat races are randomly held about 4 days a week in each stadium. And racers go to lots of different stadiums in order to compete. There are 12 races and each day, and 6 racers compete in any given race. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a serious business, and if you ever visit Japan, turn on the television and have a look at what you can see in terms of racing fixtures. And there's a total race distance of 1,800 metres. And this is what a typical race course looks like. So everything has been managed very carefully by the Japanese Speedboat Racing Association, because not only are races assigned randomly to mixed-sex or single-sex races and to different stadiums, but also the boats and the engines stay at each stadium. They buy new ones every year. They're given to the racers, not stuck together. The racers are given the boat on the day and the engine, and they have to put them together and twiddle them and adjust them and do whatever they need to do. There's an exhibition performance time immediately before the race actually starts, and that's released to all the punters, and the other racers know too. It's only one racer at a time who does the exhibition race. So, in case you're wondering about the size of these boats, they're tiny. Here they are, 6 of them in a race, with 6 tiny racers sitting on them. This is just after they've left the pit. You probably are all familiar with the premature race start, but here's a picture in case you're not. The boats can choose their preferred position after they leave the pit, but the pit is randomly allocated. The drivers jockey for the position they prefer that will give them an advantage. They do that very, very quickly, approximately 30 seconds before the race starts, and the boats accelerate. And then they have to cross the start line within 1 second after the starting clock reaches 0. Now, there are obviously 3 categories of race depending on gender composition. There's an all-male race, all-female, and then the mixed sex but because of the numbers, there are only 1 or 2 female races among 6 races in most cases of mixed-sex races. So that we don't have an equal allocation of genders. Even in so we can't, anyway, I'll explain that more in a minute. 10 minutes, okay. So I better speed up like the races. The prizes are big. I won't go into these in detail. It's actually quite a complex system, as you can imagine. Seeing so much money hinges on it, and there are ways of races progressing through to get a better ranking for their ability. And, well, take it as read that the amounts are large. This is in US dollars. So this is a sport that is really worthwhile going into if you're small and light and like racing. And the data come from the Boat Advisor website, which is within the Japanese Speedboat Racing Association. In our study, in this study, we've used only 7 of these stadiums, which provide all race records. But in a later paper, we managed to get the information from all 24 stadiums in order to look at how debut, I'm thinking about fiction here, debut races develop during their career, which is interesting. So I better move on with it. So I've already mentioned that we've got 140,000 person race observations. This is very large for this type of work, looking at gender differences in competitive behavior. And what are the results? We find that women's race time is slower in mixed-sex races than all women races, whereas male races' time is faster in mixed gender races than men-only races. So we've got 3 things that we're interested in. We're interested in race time, place in race, and lane changing. And we view the lane changing as a measure of, well, we call it aggression, that because it's quite dangerous in terms of knocking people off as well as being disqualified. And so we find that women's race time is slower in mixed-sex races, whereas men's time is faster. This is so across all of these measures. There are no gender differences in disqualification rates, and we think that these different results for men and women are likely due to gender identity. And my co-author, Iji Yamamura, said that in Japan, it's viewed by men as being very dishonorable to be beaten by a woman, which I think is a very interesting observation, because I can think of plenty of other activities where men view it as very dishonorable to be beaten by a woman. So in conclusion, we have found in this study that female competitive performance, even for women who've chosen a very competitive career and are very good at it, is enhanced by being in a single-sex environment rather than a mixed-sex environment where they are in a minority. And the gender proportion in mixed-sex boat races is skewed towards men, and this is likely to trigger awareness of gender identity. And these findings are likely to have implications for other activities in which men and women compete, and where there's a skewed gender balance, like the STEM disciplines. Being in a minority may well affect the performance of women in that situation. And I think we all know that, those of us who are trying to push the numbers of women into the STEM-type disciplines. And just to comment that sports people are selected on willingness to compete. So in this paper, our effects of mixed-sex treatment may be muted compared to other settings where selection is not as competitive. How many more minutes do I have? 5 minutes. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly mention this paper with Junming Lee from Seoul National University, when we have a very lovely data set from the South Korean television quiz show aimed at high ability girls and boys, 17-year-old on average, who took part in this very long-running TV quiz show, scholarship. So they're high-ability participants, and the questions are all geared to scholarship-related questions. But of particular interest in this was the fact that the organizers periodically changed the game technology. So we found basically that on average across all of these games that there are significant gender gaps in performance in favor of boys when we pooled all round one episodes of the quiz show. But we wanted to look at that further because these different game technologies had different effects on women's behavior. And some of them involved engaging in very public and attention-drawing activities. And remember, we're in Korea, where maybe if we'd done this in the US, there might be more willingness to seek attention, but in this society, there was not in our sample. So you might have to leap out into the front of the studio and press a button and get there before everybody else, or there might be other things that are tension-inducing activities that you might not want to engage in, rather than if you're just sitting at your lectern and you're asked a question, you know the answer and you press a button. That's easy. You don't draw attention to yourself, apart from your brilliance when you've got the answer correct. So these results are consistent with gendered behavioral responses to psychological pressure. And I don't know what we can do about that, apart from familiarity, I suppose. And finally, I haven't got time to mention this, but this was a paper with a colleague, Patrick Nolan, from the University of Essex. So what are the overall conclusions from these experiments? First of all, the environment can affect very much the economically relevant preferences of individuals. And the willingness to compete is malleable. And so that's probably well known to propagandists. But people can be made or encouraged to perform in different ways. And this has implications for countries where women are not encouraged. And we've also noticed that once women have chosen to be in a competitive environment, how well they perform is also influenced by who they're competing with. So I began today's talk by emphasizing how gender bargaining power has shifted over time with technological developments. And these power relations become codified in customs and institutions, and it takes time for these to change. Our research shows that nurture can have a powerful effect, and that culture matters. And this is something that policy can change if those in charge are willing, or if there's not too big a backlash, as we've seen in some parts of the world. Because of course the change can potentially go in either direction. You could have the change shrinking the opportunities of people as well as increasing it. Okay, so I think I'm finished.
Thank you very much, Alison. It was wonderful. Time for some questions. We have about 12, 15 minutes for questions. So, sure.
You began with sort of emphasizing the evolutionary aspect of gender differences. Do you see your work as consistent with that hypothesis, sort of evolutionary origins as a core explanation?
Well, not so much really. I wanted to mention that because I think what is really crucial is the fact that in order to get our level of intelligence and our big brains, something had to happen to the way we give birth. And that is clearly a very important evolutionary development. I mean, another one would be for women to have enormous hips, but this seems a more efficient one, the one we've developed. With regard to the other evolutionary aspects, whether it might happen in the future, whether we might be evolving, I don't know. I can't comment on that. Do you have any view on that?
Well, I was just thinking it was how you began with the evolutionary forces was in contrast to how you ended with emphasizing culture and nurture. So I was sort of, I don't know, I was just wondering.
Yeah, well, I think culture could be viewed as, it's evolving, isn't it, culture? It's evolving over time. When we look back to our great-grandmothers and their culture, that was vastly different to our own. So you could view that as a form of evolution. And who knows what might happen with artificial intelligence, that if, in the future, if we relying on that, we might lose certain skills that we might like to retain or we don't need to retain. So I think that's interesting.
In the speedboat race, you emphasized the competitiveness of the men and the women. You also indicated that lane changing is risky. And so I believe there's also been quite a bit of work on the risk preferences of men and women. Do you think of a taste for competition or competitiveness and risk preferences as the same, complementary, different things? And tell us about the components of competitiveness and risk across genders?
Yes, we have actually done work on risk preferences as well. I just chose not to focus on that today, but I think that they are complementary to some extent. Yes. Is that what you...
Oh, well, I wonder what you find in terms of risk preferences across genders then. Do you see systematic effects?
Yes, you do. You see that men are more likely to take risks than women. And in our experiments, in fact, the only place where we haven't seen that was when we were looking at single-sex co-ed schools in Britain, and we had a very nice, I won't go into the educational system there, but it was possible to compare across counties to risky and competitive behaviour. Plus, we also bused a whole lot of them to the University of Essex and put them into little groups of 4 to do further risk and competition exercises. And we found that girls who'd been at a single-sex school or were in a single-sex group for the experiment were behaving indistinguishably from the boys. But those who'd been to a co-ed school or were in a co-ed group for the day of the experiment, there was a gender difference there, which was kind of interesting because that shows the malleability and how the environment can affect behaviour. But they were going in the same direction, I should say, the risk and the competition. Yeah.
I'm curious about the mixed gender treatment in your speedboat project. So I guess because of the sample being very skewed against women, you don't have that many women in these mixed gender treatments. And I wondered whether the fact that women perform worse in mixed gender as compared to single gender treatments is because of the fact that there are just not enough of them, because that's been, I think, shown in other contexts as well. So you need more than one person, one woman in the group to actually change outcomes.
Yes.
You need some coordination.
Yes.
So in that sense, the implication could be that you actually need equality. So if your mixed gender groups had equal men and women, then perhaps they perform better as compared to a single.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I suspect that's the case, but unfortunately we can't show that with our data here. Yeah. Yes, I think being in that sort of environment when you're just one, and the race could start with all 5 men glaring at you, for example, which could have an effect.
Yeah, very interesting work, thanks. It's not my field at all, but I wanted to ask, maybe one way of thinking about it is that the opposite of competitive attitudes and preferences is cooperative attitudes and preferences. So 2 questions related to that. Is there a body of work looking at gender differences in performance in cooperative related tasks? And the second question is, one of the conclusions that you draw at the end is that we could kind of, as a society, nurture more competitive behaviour in women. But do people talk about the other possibility of more cooperative behaviour in men, or things like setting up systems to reward cooperative behaviour a bit more than competitive?
Yes, that's a good question, and I'm pretty sure there have been some studies on that, and I can't remember any of them at the moment off the top of my head, but yes, cooperation. Cooperation is a way of encouraging cooperation, is a way of potentially overcoming some of these other difficulties in human behaviour. And toxic masculinity, for example, how could you use cooperative inculcating techniques to remove that? Is it possible? And that would be quite a big research project, because we'd have to distinguish whether it's inherent or developed in certain men. So, yeah. Sorry, I can't give you an answer.
Following up to that question, basically what we observed in Olympic Games is that in a lot of those relays, if it's mixed relay, actually both men and women perform better than when it's the relay of the men or the women race. So that's something quite interesting, and I think that's probably related to the comment earlier.
Yes, I didn't hear all of your question, but I think I heard most of it.
Yeah, basically I'm saying that it's in Olympic Games. If we look at the mixed relay, actually there we see that both men and women perform better than either when they compete individually or in the same-sex relay in general.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's basically as I follow up to that comment.
Yes, yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, last question.
So we've touched at various times in this conference on male-female wage gaps or difference in labor market outcomes. It's especially prevalent at the very upper end. There are few women who are CEOs. There are not many women billionaires. One view of these positions is that they're primarily rewards to risk-taking or to winning competitive tournaments. If women have less taste for risk, if they're less competitive, what do we do about that?
Yes, that's a good question as well. But I would have to say that I also think that some of these positions and, this glass ceiling effect are because of, I view this as political economy effects, that you use your position to squeeze out competitive women, and therefore you put yourself in a situation where you've got the potential to make these enormous profits, and that many of our institutions, informal institutions, are set up to achieve that. So I'm afraid I have a rather cynical view of how society works in that respect for the top of the wages distribution.
Thank you very much, Alison. It was a thought-provoking talk. Please join me in thanking Alison.